and why I think they might do the same.
Harrison Ford, a name not merely spoken, but etched into the very essence of cinema itself. For generations, he was more than an actor. He was the embodiment of what it meant to be fearless, relentless, and unforgettable. As Han Solo, he flew across galaxies with a smirk that promised adventure. As Indiana Jones, he dug through history and myth, rewriting the definition of a cinematic hero. To millions, he wasn't playing heroes, he was one. And yet, beyond the glow of lightsabers and the crack of whips lies a man sculpted by storms most of us couldn't fathom. That voice, gravelly, certain. Those eyes, weathered yet piercing. His presence, ageless. But behind the steel resolve of his on-screen personas exists a life marked by personal battles, haunting silence, and devastating losses that not even the warmest spotlight could hide. Before the world hailed him as a living legend, before he became the figure whose image adorned posters in countless bedrooms, Harrison Ford was a man quietly shaped by heartache. He endured the collapse of marriages that had once sustained him, watched helplessly as his beloved daughter suffered under the cruel grip of illness, and even faced death itself as a plane crash carved deep scars into his body and soul. These moments never made it into the tabloids. They were not performed on a soundstage. They were lived, silently, painfully, and in the shadows. And yet, like the characters he brought to life, Ford never surrendered. He bore his tragedies not as defeats, but as proof that resilience, true resilience, begins when the audience stops watching. Now, at 83, as the twilight of his story settles in, a new question rises. What sorrow remains hidden in this final act? What echoes of heartbreak still live within a man the world believes to be invincible? Before the applause, before the billion-dollar franchises, there was a silence, a deep, paralyzing silence, that nearly smothered Harrison Ford before he could even speak his first line. A silence that grew louder with every year of his youth. He was born on July 13, 1942, in Chicago, far from the sound stages of California. His father, Christopher Ford, had been an actor himself, and his mother, Dorothy, once sang on the radio. Art was in his blood, but for young Harrison, expression didn't come easily. He wasn't the bold, adventurous spirit we'd one day cheer for. He was quiet, unsure, and deeply shy. That shyness wasn't just a phase. It was a cage. He once described himself in those early years as a very shy kid, someone who never quite fit in. By age 10, that emotional distance had hardened. In the playgrounds and classrooms of the 1950s, Ford was often a spectator, standing at the margins as other children laughed and bonded. He wasn't just quiet, he felt invisible, and that invisibility carved wounds deeper than any schoolyard cruelty. His identity, a blend of Jewish heritage from his mother and Irish Catholic roots from his father, only made him feel more out of place in a world that seemed to demand neat definitions. But even then, in the shadows of self-doubt, the seeds of adventure were stirring. At 13, Harrison joined the Boy Scouts. It was there, out in the wild, beneath the sky and among the trees, that he discovered something school could never give him: freedom. Freedom from the stifling silence. Freedom from the weight of expectation. Freedom to simply be. The forest became his escape, and that love for the outdoors never left him. Years later, it would take shape in a different form, as a pilot, soaring through open skies not just for thrill, but for solace. Nature had given him something sacred, the reminder that beyond the noise of the world, there was still quiet space for wonder. But the silence always followed him home. Through high school, then into college at Ripon College in Wisconsin, where he chose to study philosophy. The irony wasn't lost on him. A boy who had spent a lifetime searching for meaning, now studying it in lecture halls he felt disconnected from. His grades slipped. His confidence faltered. He felt invisible again. Ford would later reflect that he wasn't just a poor student. He was a lost one. By the early 1960s, as he neared the end of his college career, he seemed to stand at the edge of failure, unsure whether he even had a future. Then, almost by accident, came the spark. Desperate for credits, Ford enrolled in a drama class. He didn't join it to chase a dream. He joined it to avoid academic collapse. But that one choice changed everything. On that small stage, something in him cracked open. He wasn't confident yet, but he was seen. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about applause. It was about finding a voice after years of silence. That fragile breakthrough in college was not the beginning of a career. It was the beginning of a fight. A fight to be heard. A fight to prove that the boy who once stood at the edges could someday stand in the center. This was the true start of Harrison Ford's story. Not on a film set, not in front of a camera, but in a quiet college theater where the invisible boy first dared to be seen. In 1964, a 22-year-old Harrison Ford arrived in Los Angeles. He didn't come with a script in hand or a role waiting for him. What he brought instead was a battered car, a fragile dream, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, Hollywood would notice him. Columbia Pictures gave him a contract, $150 a week. On paper, it sounded promising. But in reality, those early roles were barely more than shadows, brief, forgettable moments on screen that vanished before his name ever appeared in the credits. The invisibility that had haunted his childhood had followed him to Hollywood. For most aspiring actors, rejection is expected. But for Harrison Ford, it was personal. He had fought so hard to find a voice. And now, in a city bursting with ambition, he was voiceless again. Casting agents judged him before he opened his mouth. Directors dismissed him after a single glance. I'd walk in and they'd decide I wasn't right before I even said a word, he would later recall. That kind of rejection doesn't just bruise, it breaks. And still, life moved forward. That same year, he married Mary Marquardt, a woman who stood by him when the spotlight refused to shine. By his mid-20s, he wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a husband. Soon after, he became a father. And with fatherhood came a new kind of pressure, one no screenplay could solve. Diapers didn't wait for auditions. Rent didn't care about dreams. So, out of necessity, Ford turned to carpentry. It was honest work, demanding work. He taught himself how to shape wood with precision, how to measure twice and cut once. It paid the bills. But each table he built, each cabinet he carved, felt like a quiet burial for the dream he once held so tightly. He later confessed, carpentry paid the bills, but broke the spirit. And still, he continued. Day after day, the routine became relentless. Auditions by morning, carpentry by afternoon, rejections by night. And in between, the quiet questions from his children, questions he didn't have the answers for. He loved his family, but that love came with a weight he struggled to carry. By the early 1970s, Ford was in his 30s, a decade older than most rising stars. He had built homes for the wealthy, installed cabinets in celebrity kitchens. But on screen, he was still a ghost, an extra in someone else's story. His friends' names were appearing in bold letters on movie posters, while he was still sanding wood, wondering if he had chosen the wrong life. He often felt like a fraud, like a man pretending to be an actor while secretly bracing for failure. I felt like a failure, he admitted, like I had no business being an actor. And yet, something inside him refused to die. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was the Boy Scout in him, the one who had once found freedom under the open sky. Whatever it was, it kept him going. And then, in 1973, a door cracked open. George Lucas was casting for a new film, American Graffiti. It was a modest project, but Ford landed a small role. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was something. A sign that maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't forgotten him. Still, the years between 1973 and 1976 remained a purgatory. He was caught between two identities, the carpenter who paid the bills and the actor who still dreamed. And then came the moment that changed everything. Ironically, it didn't begin with a casting call. It began with another carpentry job. In the mid-1970s, Harrison was hired to build some cabinets for George Lucas. The same George Lucas who had given him the tiny part in American Graffiti. As fate would have it, Lucas was now developing something different. Something strange. Something no one quite understood. A sci-fi film with odd creatures, bizarre planets, and a title that sounded more like a comic book than a blockbuster. It was called Star Wars. Lucas invited Ford to read lines, not as an audition, but to help other actors prepare. But something happened in that room. Something no one expected. As Ford read the lines of a rogue smuggler named Han Solo, the room shifted. This wasn't just reading. It was becoming. The carpenter disappeared. The legend was born. When Star Wars hit theaters in 1977, it wasn't just a success. It was a cultural explosion. Audiences fell in love with Han Solo's swagger, his sarcasm, his charm. And behind that charm was a man who had once built cabinets for rent money. The Invisible Man had become unforgettable. But fame, like fire, burns both ways. Overnight, Harrison Ford became a global icon. Han Solo wasn't just a character. He was a cultural phenomenon. Ford's smirk became a rebellion in itself, his every line quoted, every gesture mimicked by millions. But behind the meteoric rise was a man still coming to terms with the scale of what had happened. He had been invisible for so long that visibility now felt like exposure. The world saw the rogue pilot, the galactic outlaw, but few saw the man who still carried the wounds of a life built on rejection. Then lightning struck twice. In 1981, Raiders of the Lost Ark hit theaters. With a whip in hand and a fedora tipped against the sun, Ford introduced the world to Indiana Jones, an archaeologist with a taste for danger and a soul full of grit. The film wasn't just a hit. It redefined the adventure genre, cementing Ford's place as not just a star, but a cornerstone of cinematic myth. He wasn't merely playing roles. He was becoming part of cultural memory. Han Solo and Indiana Jones weren't just characters, they were mythologies. They didn't just entertain, they inspired. They lived in lunchboxes, comic books, action figures, and the dreams of a generation raised on the promise that courage could take you anywhere. But those mythologies came at a cost. You don't get to walk away from them, Ford would later say. And he was right. The world adored the legend, but rarely asked about the man beneath it. His image was etched in stone, but his spirit was still flesh, still vulnerable. He could have easily been caged by these franchises, become the permanent face of adventure, forever typecast. But Harrison Ford refused to be boxed in. He pursued roles that went beyond the action hero, choosing scripts that dared to ask deeper questions. In Blade Runner, 1982, he embodied a detective wrestling with the very nature of identity and humanity. The film wasn't a blockbuster in its time, but it became a cult classic, cementing his place in science fiction lore as more than just a rebel with a blaster. Then came Witness, 1985, where he played a hardened cop hiding within the pacifist world of the Amish. His performance earned him an Academy Award nomination and proved that beneath the blockbuster aura was a serious actor, one capable of restraint, nuance, and emotional gravity. The Fugitive, 1993, showed a different kind of heroism, a man on the run not with a weapon, but with the sheer determination to clear his name. And in Air Force One, 1997, he played a president who fought terrorists with grit and raw resolve, his command so convincing it blurred the line between fiction and national myth. Each role layered upon the last, forming a cinematic cathedral of myth, emotion, and meaning. And with each new film came ever-increasing rewards. From the modest $10,000 paycheck for Star Wars to the staggering $65 million he earned for Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Ford's rise was not just creative, it was financial. By the mid-1990s, his films had grossed over $9 billion globally. He had become one of the highest-paid, most bankable actors in history. But even as the world celebrated him, the silence returned. Fame, for all its shine, can become a mask, a weight, an armor that protects the myth but suffocates the man. And Ford, more than most, knew the burden of being mistaken for a legend rather than seen as a human. Behind the curtain of applause, he struggled. He had once longed for recognition. Now, he found himself longing for something far rarer: peace, stillness, anonymity. But in the spotlight, there is no escape. Fame gave him everything, and took just as much. The roles that made him untouchable also isolated him. He became more symbol than man. Han, Indy, the President, the Fugitive. To the world, these were heroes. But to Harrison Ford, they were masks he couldn't take off. And while audiences saw a man who always outran death, what they didn't see was a soul haunted by the very success he had once chased. And so, the paradox deepened. He had conquered galaxies, unearthed ancient relics, and survived the impossible. But in doing so, he found himself trapped in a legend too big to step away from. The man who had once been invisible had now become someone the world refused to stop looking at. And in the glare of that constant attention, his personal life, quiet, sacred, and fragile, began to crumble. Harrison Ford's stardom had reached its zenith, but back home, The cost of that ascent was becoming unbearable. The man once surrounded by failure was now surrounded by admirers, fans, reporters, and relentless demands. And Mary Marquardt, the woman who had stood by him during the days of unpaid roles and silent dinners, now found herself watching her husband disappear, not physically, but spiritually. They had married in 1964, when he was still a struggling dreamer, with more rejection slips than callbacks. Mary was there through every door slammed in his face, through every night he returned home, empty-handed and exhausted from another fruitless audition. She worked. She raised their children. She kept the house together while Ford pursued a dream that seemed to always exist just out of reach. She had shared him with poverty. But fame, she would learn, was even more unforgiving. By the late 1970s, as Star Wars took over the world, the man Mary had known, the man who used to build cabinets to keep food on the table, was suddenly being claimed by millions. He was no longer Harrison, her husband. He was Han Solo to the planet. And the intimacy that had once made their home a refuge began to dissolve. He traveled constantly. He worked endlessly. And when he was home, it often felt like he wasn't really there. Then came the whispers. Rumors of a behind-the-scenes romance with co-star Carrie Fisher. Rumors that, for Mary, stung like truth, regardless of what anyone said. Whether it was a fleeting moment or something more, what mattered was that the man she had built a life with was slowly drifting into a world she could no longer touch. And by 1979, their marriage was over. 15 years of devotion ended not with angry fights, but with silence, the kind that echoes in a household where children no longer hear both parents laughing together. Their sons, Ben and Willard, watched the family they knew unravel under the harsh light of global attention. They saw their father on movie posters, on talk shows, on red carpets, but not always at home. For Mary, the pain was personal and invisible. While the world celebrated her husband's rise, she grieved in the shadows. Ford rarely spoke of her in later years, not out of dismissal, but perhaps because every memory was a mirror, a reminder of who he had been and what he had let go in the pursuit of greatness. And behind all the charm and confidence of Han Solo, behind the unwavering determination of Indiana Jones, there was a deeper truth. Harrison Ford's first great love had been the first great casualty of his success. But the story didn't end there. In 1983, Ford married again, this time to Melissa Matheson, a brilliant screenwriter known for penning the script to E.T., a film about longing, connection, and the ache of being far from home. It was, in many ways, a reflection of Ford's own inner world. He, too, had become someone who often felt distant from the places and people who once grounded him. Melissa was not the same as Mary. She met him at the height of his fame, not in its absence. She was a partner during his golden years, not his silent years. And for a while, it seemed that Ford had found something close to redemption, an equilibrium between his public legend and his private self. They had 2 children together, Malcolm and Georgia, and for some years, their home was filled with a fragile peace. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. When their daughter Georgia was diagnosed with epilepsy, it shook their entire world. Ford, who had spent his life portraying heroes who outsmarted death, found himself powerless. No spaceship, no whip, no presidential speech could silence the seizures that threatened his little girl's life. Friends described how Ford would go silent when never asked about her condition, as if the very words were too heavy to carry aloud. In one act of quiet desperation, he auctioned off his iconic Han Solo jacket to raise money for epilepsy research. To fans, it was a gesture of generosity. To Ford, it was something far more vulnerable, a father reaching into the only toolbox he had, fame, to try to fix something fame could never touch. Meanwhile, Melissa shouldered the daily weight of caring for their daughter. While Ford was often away filming, she was at home, holding the pieces together. She was brilliant, composed, and fiercely private. But behind the elegance was exhaustion. Behind the composure was heartbreak. And as the years went on, their bond weakened, not out of anger, but out of the relentless erosion caused by distance, silence, and grief. By the early 2000s, their marriage was fraying. Ford's schedule grew more consuming, and Melissa, though accomplished in her own right, was beginning to fade into the background of a life that once celebrated her creativity. They separated, then quietly divorced in 2004. The headlines focused on the $85 million settlement, one of the largest in Hollywood history. But what the world didn't see was the quieter cost. For Melissa, it was the loss of a two-decade love. For Ford, it was the disintegration of another family. And for their children, it was another chapter of pain in a story already marked by sacrifice. But the most devastating moment would come years later. By the time the 2010s arrived, Harrison Ford had entered a new season in his life. He had endured the end of 2 marriages, carried the weight of fame and fatherhood, and survived moments of physical and emotional collapse. But the blow that followed was one no script could prepare him for. In 2015, Melissa Matheson, his former wife, the mother of 2 of his children, the woman who had once helped him build a life beyond the screen, was diagnosed with neuroendocrine cancer. Within months, she was gone. She was only 65 years old. Though their marriage had ended years earlier, her passing struck Ford like thunder. To the world, she was his ex-wife. To him, she had been the silent witness to 1,000 unspoken struggles, the woman who stood by him during the fragile balance between fatherhood and fame, the one who bore their daughter's pain with grace, who built a home while the world demanded his image. At the time of her death, Ford had already remarried. But friends noticed something different in him after the news broke. He became quieter, more inward. Reporters noted his uncharacteristic stillness, the way his eyes lingered longer in interviews, as if the past was whispering to him even amid the present. When asked about Melissa in the years that followed, Ford rarely spoke. And when he did, his voice was clipped. The pauses between his words were longer, as though language itself was insufficient to carry what he still held inside. Some losses are loud, others live in silence. Melissa's death was the latter. To those who knew him best, that silence said everything. It was the silence of a man who had lost twice, once when their marriage ended, and again when life ended hers. It was the silence of a father who had begged for his child's healing and carried the guilt of not being there enough. It was the silence of a man who realized that fame could win battles in the box office, but not in a hospital room. The arc of Harrison Ford's life with Melissa was never about glamour. It was about struggle, loyalty, endurance, and sorrow. It was about raising children under the shadow of illness. It was about surviving public attention while slowly breaking in private. And when the final curtain fell for Melissa, Ford wasn't just a Hollywood icon mourning a former partner. He was a man staring at the finality of loss, raw, real, and irreversible. But as life often does, it moved forward. And somewhere along the way, as if fate decided to offer him something different, something softer, Ford met someone who would change the rhythm of his later years. In 2002, at a Golden Globe afterparty, he crossed paths with Callista Flockhart. She was known to the world as the quirky, bright-eyed star of Ally McBeal. He was the grizzled Hollywood veteran, weathered, iconic, untouchable. On paper, it seemed unlikely. But in person, something shifted. Ford didn't fall for her fame. He didn't fall for the lights that followed her. He fell for something far rarer in his world: her calm, her warmth, her ability to quiet the noise that had chased him for decades. Their relationship didn't unfold in tabloids. It grew in private, deliberately, away from the red carpets and magazine covers. Ford, now in his 60s, had finally learned the difference between burning passion and enduring peace. With Callista, it was the latter. Unlike his previous marriages, they had no biological children together. But Callista came into the relationship with an adopted son, Liam. And Ford, scarred by his own past as a sometimes absent father, chose differently this time. He didn't just tolerate Liam. He embraced him, fully, not out of obligation, but out of love. Not because the world was watching, but because this was a second chance at fatherhood, a chapter not driven by guilt, but by presence. Friends noticed the change. The way his hardened edges softened. The way he laughed more, lingered longer, listened deeper. In 2010, they married quietly in New Mexico. No flashing lights, no screaming press. Just 2 people choosing each other. Soon after, they retreated far from the noise of Los Angeles and the mythology of Hollywood. They settled on an 800-acre ranch in Wyoming, a place of vast skies, whispering winds, and silence of a different kind. Not the crushing silence of invisibility or loss, but the peaceful silence of being finally, fully present. Ford still worked. He still flew planes. But his life was no longer centered around premieres or paychecks. It was centered around mornings on horseback, evenings by the fire, dinners filled with laughter, and the gentle rhythm of a family that had learned to breathe again. Then came 2015. While filming Star Wars, The Force Awakens, inside the Millennium Falcon, the very ship that had launched him into legend, a hydraulic door malfunctioned and crashed down on him, shattering his leg. The irony was brutal. The symbol of his immortality had become the weapon of his fragility. Han Solo, the indestructible, lay pinned and broken beneath steel. Production halted. The crew stood in shock. Ford was rushed into surgery. The world watched, stunned. And though Ford would later joke about it, even using a toy model on a late-night show to demonstrate what happened, those closest to him knew it wasn't funny. It was terrifying. For the first time, the gap between the legend and the man could no longer be denied. He was vulnerable, mortal, breakable. The image was seared into the minds of those on set. Han Solo, the icon of rebellion and resilience, lying motionless beneath the very ship that had once symbolized adventure and escape. The Millennium Falcon, once a vessel of dreams, had become a brutal reminder that no one, not even legends, could escape time. Ford endured the surgery. He healed. He smiled through interviews and reassured fans that everything was fine. But something in him had shifted. There was a new awareness in his eyes, a new weight in his movements. A man who had outrun boulders and leapt from rooftops was now learning what it meant to pause, to consider, to accept. And yet, fate wasn't finished testing him. Just 1 year later, in March 2015, Ford took to the skies in one of his beloved vintage planes. Flying was more than a hobby for him. It was therapy, solitude in motion, a place where the wind drowned out the noise of fame. But that flight, like the door on the Falcon, would betray him. Mid-air, the engine failed. The aircraft spiraled and crashed into a golf course in Los Angeles. The wreckage was horrific. To witnesses, it looked final. The twisted metal, the scattered debris, it told a story that should have ended in tragedy. And for a few terrifying hours, the world thought it had. Callista, his wife, later described those moments as the longest of her life. She waited in a hospital, praying, imagining the worst, bracing for a reality she wasn't ready to face. "I thought I'd lost him," she whispered in an interview. And for a moment, she had. But Harrison Ford survived. He didn't just walk away, he crawled back. Through pain, through rehabilitation, through the slow and stubborn process of putting himself back together. The world called it a miracle. Callista called it a second chance. But even miracles leave scars. Though he eventually returned to filming, something had changed. The man who once insisted on doing his own stunts began to move with more calculation. The wit was still there, the presence still undeniable. But beneath it all was the unspoken reality of age and its relentless erosion. He no longer just played wounded heroes. He was one. And still, he refused to stop. In 2021, while rehearsing a fight scene for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, Ford tore his shoulder. Production halted. Surgery followed. The healing was slow, the pain persistent. But when the cameras rolled again, there he was, back in the fedora, whip in hand, eyes narrowed with determination. The audience saw Indiana Jones. But behind the scenes, it was Ford, 80 years old, bones aching, moving slower, pushing through pain with the stubborn defiance of someone who didn't know how to quit. His humor remained dry as ever. When asked about aging, he quipped, "It beats the alternative." But Callista noticed. She noticed the care in every step, the stiffness in every movement, the way he paused before rising, the subtle winces that replaced the swagger. At night, she heard him shift in bed, restless from aches that lingered long after the cameras had stopped rolling. And yet, he pressed forward. Not because he had something to prove, but because it was simply who he was. Harrison Ford didn't act for legacy. He acted because it was still the truest expression of himself, a place where silence was transformed into presence. In 2023, when Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny premiered at Cannes, the world rose to its feet. The applause was thunderous, but beneath that applause was a farewell. A farewell to the man who had given his body to the screen for nearly 5 decades. As Ford stood on that stage, eyes glistening, voice cracking, he said simply, "I'm deeply moved." It wasn't just gratitude. It was grief. A chapter had closed, not just for a franchise, but for a man who had spent his life defying the limits of age, injury, and expectation. But to speak only of pain would be to miss the deeper beauty of his later years. Even as his body betrayed him, Ford continued to give, to his family, to his fans, to the planet itself. He didn't retreat into luxury or vanish behind gates of wealth. He leaned into something nobler. As vice chair of Conservation International, Ford became a warrior for the environment, lending his voice and resources to preserve the Earth's most vulnerable places. Long before climate activism became fashionable, he was already donating land, speaking at summits, and using his name not for applause, but for impact. He once said, "Nature doesn't need people. People need nature." And he meant it. Half of his beloved Wyoming ranch, 400 acres, was turned into a conservation easement. It wasn't a photo op. It was a legacy. And there was more. Ford has flown rescue missions in his personal helicopter, helping to locate missing hikers and stranded climbers in the unforgiving terrain of the American wilderness. Quiet, unsung acts of heroism. No cameras, no red carpets. Just a man with the means, the skill, and the heart to act. The man who once saved the galaxy on screen had, in his own quiet way, saved real lives. But even as he gave, he grieved. For all that he gave, his time, his wealth, his voice, Harrison Ford could not escape the quiet weight of outliving nearly everyone who had once held a piece of his heart. Mary Marquardt, the woman who believed in him before the world ever did, watched their marriage fall apart under the weight of stardom. Her departure was silent, private, but it left a fracture in his story that never truly healed. They had built a life together when no one else believed in his dream. And when that dream finally arrived, it took more than it gave. Melissa Matheson, the woman who stood with him through fame's most suffocating years, left not through betrayal or conflict, but through illness, swift, brutal, and irreversible. Her death wasn't a tabloid tragedy. It was a deeply personal loss. The kind of loss that lingers in empty rooms, in photos tucked away, in the quiet questions of children who grow up missing the warmth of a voice they barely remember. Then there was Carrie Fisher. Their affair had lasted only 3 months during the filming of Star Wars, but its impact endured far longer. They had never spoken openly about it for decades, until Carrie, with her signature blend of wit and honesty, finally revealed their secret in her 2016 memoir, The Princess Diarist. To her, it had been a whirlwind of vulnerability and tension, a moment suspended between youth and the shadow of a man already burdened by life. For Ford, it remained largely unspoken. His response to her revelations was brief, measured, almost guarded. But those who knew him could read the silence. It wasn't denial. It was grief. And then, just months after the book's release, she was gone. In December 2016, Carrie Fisher passed away unexpectedly at the age of 60. To the world, she was Princess Leia, a symbol of resistance, strength, and intelligence. To Ford, she was something quieter, a moment frozen in time, a glimpse of tenderness during a season of personal collapse. A co-star who had, if only for a short while, seen him not as Han Solo, but as a man. His public statement after her death was short. She was one of a kind, brilliant, original, funny, but those who knew him best understood the emotion behind the brevity. Some silences are more painful than words, and Ford carried this one quietly, reverently. Carrie had been the spark that briefly lit a darker time in his life. A moment of intimacy wrapped in secrecy, affection, and inevitable regret. And now, that moment, too, had slipped beyond reach. Mary, Melissa, Carrie, each woman represented a chapter. Each one shaped him, and each one left, taking a part of him with them. But perhaps what made their absence even more difficult was not their departure, but his survival. Because to survive, in Ford's world, had never simply meant living. It meant watching the people who once defined you vanish, one by one, until only memories remained. It meant outliving not just characters and franchises, but connections. And with every goodbye, he seemed to grow quieter, not in fame, but in spirit. Even his children bore the weight of his journey. Ben and Willard, from his first marriage, had grown up watching their father become someone the entire world wanted a piece of, while they waited at home, hoping for time, for attention, for something resembling normalcy. Malcolm and Georgia, his children with Melissa, knew a father consumed by the dual roles of Hollywood icon and husband to a woman carrying the relentless burden of a daughter's illness. And Liam, Callista's adopted son, whom Ford had embraced as his own, was now watching an older version of that father. A man no longer running, no longer chasing stardom, but slowly coming to terms with the price he had paid for a life on screen. The irony was cruel. Ford, who had portrayed so many indestructible heroes, now bore the proof of his own mortality in every scar, every surgery, every limping step. He had lived through plane crashes, bone fractures, the breaking of homes, and the loss of love. He had endured the unimaginable and still pressed on. But that endurance came with a cost. There were evenings on his Wyoming ranch, vast, beautiful, silent, when the world outside grew still. And in that stillness, the memories returned. Faces now gone, voices now quiet. Rooms that once echoed with laughter, now humming with nothing but wind. He had wealth, more than most could fathom. His net worth had soared beyond $300 million. His properties stretched across America, from Brentwood to Manhattan to the expansive ranch where he had finally found peace. His garages held vintage Jaguars, classic Mercedes, Teslas, and private jets. He owned a Cessna Sovereign valued higher than most people's lifetime earnings. But money never filled the empty seat at a dinner table. And no matter how many planes he owned, he could never fly back to the moments he wished he'd stayed longer. So what remains? What do we make of a man who has lived this long, loved this hard, and lost so much? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the films, not in the box office numbers, not in the trophies or the franchises, but in the fact that Harrison Ford, for all the wounds he carries, continues to rise. At 83 years old, Harrison Ford stands not as the action figure of old, but as a man shaped by time. He walks a little slower now. His shoulder still aches from the injury on the set of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. His leg bears the memory of the Millennium Falcon's betrayal. And his eyes, those same eyes that once defied empires, now carry the weight of everything he has endured. He still works out. He still flies. He still insists on presence. But the body, after a lifetime of punishment, has its own rhythm now. A quieter one. On his ranch in Wyoming, where the land stretches endlessly toward the sky, Ford has found what he spent a lifetime searching for. Not applause, not recognition, not legend, but peace. And perhaps, finally, rest. There are no red carpets here. No studio lots or press junkets. Just open fields, grazing horses, and the woman who stayed, Callista. They shared dinners by the fire, laughed quietly with Liam, and watched the seasons change not from a hotel window, but from the front porch of a life they built with intention, not ambition. It is not the life of a celebrity. It is the life of a survivor. And in that life, there is still purpose. Ford continues to fight for the environment with unflinching passion. As Vice Chair of Conservation International, his speeches, though rare, cut deep. He doesn't speak for effect. He speaks because it matters. And when he does, the world listens. Not because he played heroes, but because he has lived with the consequences of what happens when people stop acting like them. This, perhaps, is the truest Harrison Ford. Not the smuggler who flew the Falcon, not the archaeologist who found the Arkansas, but the man who stayed upright through grief. The father who learned too late, but still tried to be better. The husband who finally found a love that didn't collapse under the weight of legacy. The quiet rescuer in the wilderness. The voice for forests and rivers. His story is not one of perfection. It is not sanitized, polished, or wrapped in cinematic closure. It is marked by pain, failure, broken promises, and countless silences that lasted too long. And yet, he continued. He continues. Because sometimes, heroism isn't about charging into danger. Sometimes, it's about waking up each day, carrying the weight of your own choices, and still choosing to move forward. And in doing so, Harrison Ford has given us something far greater than any role. He has shown us what it means to live beyond the myth. To rise again and again when the world expects you to fall. To bleed, to break, to lose, and still give. Still love, still show up. He once said, "The trick of life is to enjoy the passage of time." And though time has left marks on his body, deep lines on his face, and quiet gaps in his memory, It has not taken from him the most important thing, his spirit, that indomitable, stubborn, relentless spirit that has carried him through fires most men would not survive. He is no longer the invincible rogue of our childhoods. He is not the whip-cracking archaeologist or the blaster-wielding pilot. He is something rarer. He is real. And that, in the end, is what makes him unforgettable. His story doesn't close with a triumphant fanfare or a climactic rescue. It closes with the quiet truth that the most powerful legacy is not the one built in film, but the one carried in the hearts of those who remember. So now we turn to you. What has Harrison Ford meant to you? Was it Han Solo, the rebel with a smirk who showed us that even smugglers could be heroes? Was it Indiana Jones, the fearless adventurer who chased legends across time and space? Or was it the man himself, the father, the survivor, the advocate, the human being who never gave up? Share your memory. Share your moment. Let's honor not just the legend, but the life behind it. Because some stories deserve to be remembered, and this, the story of Harrison Ford, is one of them.